Hello, I'm Matthew Van Deventer, and this is a talk called What is a Witness Like? Which attempts to answer the question, what is a witness like game, if we kind of think of witness like as a genre. So, why should you care what I have to say about this? Well, 2022, which is a few years ago at this point, I released a game called Taiji, which is a witness like game that I spent about 8 years making. So, I do have some experience with the topic of witness like games. So, what is a witness like? Well, obviously, it's a game that's like The Witness, but what is The Witness? So, of course, I won't be able to boil The Witness down to an elevator pitch, but if you're totally unfamiliar with it, although this talk probably will be very confusing, I will at least attempt to give a brief overview. So, The Witness is a open world adventure puzzle solving game. It takes inspiration from Myst and Riven. It's set on a mysterious abandoned island, and there's different distinct zones around the island that have their own visual themes and gameplay themes as well. The thing that is very different about The Witness versus other first person adventure games is that around the island you find these puzzle screens. And this is one of the very early puzzles in the game. And so you just have to kind of draw a line from this bulb here through the maze to the little end point here. So it's just an extremely early puzzle. It's just kind of meant to get you used to the controls and how the game operates. But every single puzzle in the entire game is of this draw a line through a maze variety. And what the game does is it just layers additional rules and context on top of that core mechanic in order to build up more interesting challenges. And eventually, the game builds up to a point where you might get to puzzles like this one that could take you an hour or more to solve. Um, and using this very basic line drawing mechanic as a baseline, the game kind of uses that as a lens to allow the player to kind of explore a different way of looking at the world. Um, and importantly, the game gets there entirely non-verbally. Although there are some verbal story elements in the game, they don't act as hints for puzzles or anything. Okay, so let's come back to that question of what is a witness-like game? So it's a genre that includes The Witness, but it also, at this point, I would say it at least includes a few other games. I'm not going to like elaborate on each of these individual ones because they will come up later in the talk. So, however, there is a question about which elements are the most important because The Witness is a very large game with many different elements. Um, I tend to be a proponent of holistic game design, which means that I think that kind of all the elements of a game, the story, the art, sound, and the gameplay all have to be considered kind of part of the game design. And it's not really straightforward to separate them out and analyze them individually because they all interact in the player's mind. However, because The Witness is a big game and is very complex, and we need to have some kind of structure for this talk, I've decided to like kind of split the discussion of the game up into three major categories: gameplay, environment, and story. But just remember that I'm pretty grumpy about this, and I'm grumpy enough that I've permitted myself a slight little rant here. At an earlier point in the talk's development, this was like a half a manuscript page, but it's just a paragraph now, and I will read this paragraph and call it that. The Witness is an art game. The puzzles are a means to an end, that end being the transformation of the player's perceptions outside of the game. So, The Witness is an art game, but I do think that you can count games as Witness likes even if they're not trying to do much beyond being an interesting puzzle game, so long as they have enough kind of similar elements. So let's discuss gameplay elements first. So the first and kind of maybe most fundamental element of gameplay in a witness-like game is abstract and consistent core puzzle gameplay. So by that I mean there's puzzle gameplay that's very consistent across all of the different puzzles in the game. So much like in a first person shooter where you'd have core gameplay and that loop involves like you shooting enemies and getting health packs and whatever. I mean that all of the puzzles in these games are sort of expressed in a way that's very consistent, and you're doing this kind of loop over and over again of doing these puzzles. And there's no guessing about what is or isn't a puzzle in the game because you kind of know it when you see it. So here's just 3 examples. In the Witness, you of course draw lines through mazes. In Taiji, you toggle tiles on and off, and in Chow, you connect nodes together. So although having 2D kind of grid puzzles on a panel is a very convenient way to produce this sort of abstraction, it's not the only way to do it. For example, in Sensorium, you have these kind of buttons, and that's like the motif. And most people would consider this game a Witness-like, I think. But the puzzles, are more physically present in the world, and they're not necessarily always arranged in kind of this grid pattern. But the puzzles do have this button motif, and you could consider that sufficiently abstracted from the surrounding environment. Here's another example from Lingo 2, which does also have these puzzle screens, but it's actually a word guessing game. So for this puzzle, you have to guess like a 3-letter word. The clue is I, and then there's this sort of strange symbol in the middle of the puzzle, which over the course of the game, you learn that means that your solution needs to rhyme with the given word. Okay, so I want to take a second to emphasize what I mean by abstract, because I think that one of the key elements of Witness-like puzzle games is that the puzzles themselves are like abstractions from the environment in some way. So all interaction with the environment should kind of happen indirectly, with the puzzles being the only interface with which the player engages through the game. And that differentiates this from games like Portal or Talos Principle, which do have core puzzle gameplay, but the puzzles there primarily involve direct interaction with the environment, and you're moving around kind of physical puzzle pieces directly. Even if you're like shooting portals, you're still like directly interacting with the environment rather than through some kind of abstraction. Okay, so the second most important gameplay element for a Witness-like game is inductive rule discovery puzzles. What I mean by that is that the puzzle solving in the game is often done without a complete understanding of what the rules even are. This is really most apparent with the puzzles that have abstract symbols. The player's like confronted with these symbols, and they have to experiment and develop their theories about what they might mean. And over the course of the game, their understanding of those symbols develops and becomes more correct and nuanced, to the point that puzzles can become very large and challenging. Another way to think about this is that the puzzles require inductive reasoning as opposed to deductive reasoning. So in deductive reasoning, the player's like given certain facts that they know are true. They're guaranteed these things are true, and then they just must reason from there about the consequences of those. So because I know X is true, therefore Y must also be true. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, means the player is like only given examples, and they have to guess about what the rules are by experimenting with those examples. So in this case, X seems to be true, so perhaps Y is also true. And importantly, the difference with inductive reasoning is because it's based on limited knowledge, it allows for the reasoner's conclusions to be incorrect. Whereas with deductive reasoning, the only way that the deducer would be incorrect is if they just made logical mistakes in their conclusion. But assuming that they didn't make any logical mistakes, they can't be incorrect. In practice, Witness-like puzzle games will tend to go from an inductive reasoning stage earlier on, where you're trying to figure out the rules, to more deductive reasoning later, once the player has kind of like got a handle on how things work. So, as an example of deductive reasoning, I want to contrast Witness-like games with Islands of Insight, which is another open world puzzle game, but this game lists all of the relevant rules for each puzzle along the right side of the screen, which means the challenge in this game is never about guessing what the rules are, but is entirely derived from the player following through on the consequences of those rules. Whereas in a Witness-like game, like the mystery about what the rules even are is like half of the game. So the examples that I've shown so far featured abstract symbols embedded in the puzzle, which is, it's a very visually clear example of rule discovery because you either know what the symbol means or you don't. But it's not a requirement that you have abstract symbols for inductive rule discovery puzzles. The only requirement is that there's a consistent rule set that carries across multiple puzzles and it doesn't change. Although, for playability reasons, I think even if you don't have symbols embedded in the puzzle, you should have some kind of recognizable design elements, which all puzzles of the same type share, so that the player can recognize future puzzles of that type. So in this case, that's like sort of these notches that are along the edge of the grid. So that means that the player, anytime they see a puzzle with these kind of notches, that's like a hint to them that, oh, right, I've seen that somewhere. Maybe it's this rule. So rule discovery is often thought of as like the most important element in witness-like games. For example, many people would consider this game Understand to be a witness-like game, which consists almost entirely of rule discovery puzzles. However, I would argue that Understand doesn't feature enough of the key genre elements to really fully qualify as a witness-like, although it does overlap in the two aspects that we've discussed so far. So the next important element in witness-like games is sophisticated nonverbal communication. So all games non-verbally communicate with the player, and obviously that's not even something that's unique to video games. And this has been happening in games at least as far back as Super Mario Brothers. You've probably seen a dozen video essays on the internet about how the first level of Super Mario Bros. Teaches the player how to play the game without words, right? World 1-1 of Mario Bros. Actually is like kind of famous enough that it has its own Wikipedia page. It's just sort of like a canonical example of maybe an early version of nonverbal communication in games. So what really makes the witness unique in this regard? I would say that it's sophistication. So as nonverbal communication becomes more sophisticated, I think it kind of goes through a phase change similar to like ice turning into water, where it becomes a qualitatively different thing. I'll make a little bit of an analogy to verbal communication to enhance what I mean by this. So oftentimes players will think that the witness is unique in that it teaches the player to play without words. But the verbal equivalent of this, like teaching the player how to play a game with words, would be an instruction manual. And although instruction manuals can be very effective at explaining how something works, they're not very creatively expressive. And, apologies to all of the instruction manual designers out there, but I don't think anybody would consider them to be fine art. This is a contrast to very sophisticated literature like novels, which do sometimes include explanations of things, particularly in science fiction and fantasy. But being overburdened by explanation is usually considered exposition, and that's poor writing. Because the point of literature is not really to just explain things to the reader, but it's to surprise and delight them and to elicit complex emotions and thoughts. And games really should attempt to do the same thing. So hopefully that's enough of an analogy to understand that, but I'm kind of going to go a little self-indulgent here, and I want to make another analogy to film because I think that there's kind of more here that can be dug into. So many times before, although less recently, but I would say in like the mid 2000s, this sort of peaked. Whenever a significant game was released, there was often chatter on the internet about like whether this game might finally be the Citizen Kane of video games. Like people were discussing this about like BioShock Infinite or like The Last of Us. The idea being that Citizen Kane represented a point at which film matured as a medium and that video games had not yet reached this point. So I'm not gonna argue whether or not The Witness is like the Citizen Kane of video games, but I do want to discuss what made Citizen Kane the Citizen Kane of film. So in the early days of film, most productions were really just utilizing the techniques that were commonly used before then in stage plays, only with now a camera recording them. And there wasn't a lot of additional attention that was paid to the specific techniques that were enabled by the new medium of film. Um, so this is just kind of a list of, techniques that were existing in plays before film came along, and then some techniques that are more enhanced by film, like film has more control over these things, and then there's some unique techniques over on the right. Now, many of these techniques had been already explored in prior films, but Citizen Kane was kind of the earliest film to effectively combine all of these techniques that were available to express a singular vision. So again, it's mostly about sophistication. And to utilize that water to ice analogy again, a state change had occurred, and something that was truly new, that was greater than the sum of its parts, had been born. A film that couldn't exist outside of its medium. Another important thing to note is like many of these film-only techniques, actually all of the ones that I'm listing here, are entirely nonverbal. And that may not be by accident, because if you just want to express yourself verbally, then you could just write a book, and there's no real sense in faffing around with cameras and costumes. Okay, so to bring this back to video games, my point is that there's like an equivalent set of techniques which video games are particularly suited toward, and some that video games are the only thing that's capable of. And I think that pushing the state of the art of game design forwards requires understanding and utilizing these unique techniques to put forth a singular vision. And again, I'm not going to argue that The Witness is the Citizen Kane of video games, but it is, I think, the current state of the art along this axis. So there's a lot of techniques here, and I don't want to sidebar on this too hard, because I think like this could kind of be an entire talk on its own. But I will say that I think that some of the all-time classics of video games tend to focus on things on the right, and pushing game design forwards requires including all of these techniques as best you can, and you'll find a lot of games that are sort of popular in the moment are focusing on things that are more on the left-hand side over here. Okay. So another important gameplay aspect of Witness-like games is knowledge-gated progression. So a design conundrum that can come up when you have an open world game, especially one where the player has to learn many of the rules over the course of the game, is that you may not know whether or not the player understands a given rule when they approach a certain puzzle. And because the game's so non-linear, the player might end up confronted with a puzzle that's impossible for them to solve. The most straightforward solution to this is just to have a linear game instead of an open world game, and the player just has to complete simpler puzzles in order to unlock the more advanced ones. However, there's at least 3 problems with making a puzzle game linear. The first problem is that a player could get completely roadblocked. If they can't solve a puzzle, they get to a puzzle and it's just too hard for them, that's it. There's nothing else they can even do in the game, because it's an entirely linear experience, and game's over as far as they're concerned, unless they can look it up in a walkthrough or something. The second is that the player also just can't exceed the expectations that the designer has baked in. So even if a player is particularly clever, they can never really skip ahead. They have to like do everything piecemeal the way that you've set it up. And a third problem is that you probably have different kinds of ideas in your game that don't really have a clear order to them. But if you have a linear game, then you're sort of forced to give them a linear order, when really maybe it makes much more sense to have a structure that like lets the player just pick which one they want to do. But even if you have a nonlinear structure, right, you can run into issues when you want to mix different ideas together. You've got this star area where you learn about what that means, and then you've got the pentagon area and you learn what that means, but like, how do you know for sure what the player knows, and how can we have an area that mixes those things together? So a common solution to that might be to place the area that mixes them together behind a locked door, and you have keys to that door that are found by completing the relevant areas. And so the player's kind of possession of these keys sort of is a proxy for their understanding of those different rules. But this is, again, a little inflexible, because maybe the player knows enough to do that area, but they haven't like finished the prerequisite areas completely, but they understand the rules, right? So wouldn't it be much better if we could just test their understanding directly? Like, what if that locked door was just a puzzle and the key was in your brain? So the witness does exactly this. It presents the player with what I call knowledge gates, which are just puzzles that are designed to require you to have knowledge that's gained elsewhere in the game to solve. Designing these kind of puzzles is pretty tricky. I also use them in Taiji because they need to be the puzzles need to be complex enough so that the player can't just brute force them, because you don't want players that don't understand the rules to be able to get past the gate. But ideally, you also want them to fall relatively easily for a knowledgeable player. So something that happened earlier on in developing Taiji is that I found a lot of players were using knowledge gates as a way to learn the mechanics of each of the sub areas, and they were generally having a bad time. The reason they could do this is because there's this mechanic in the witness also has this mechanic where when you submit a solution to a puzzle, the currently errored symbols flash red. This meant that players that were working on one of these knowledge gate puzzles could kind of piecemeal solve the puzzle because they could just satisfy one of the symbols on the panel. So ultimately, I decided upon disabling this feature on knowledge gate puzzles, which is also what the witness does. And I was reluctant to do that initially because you kind of want to have as much freedom as possible in the game. But there's a bigger problem than having the player just kind of do things out of order. And that's that if they learn what the symbols mean at a knowledge gate puzzle, then when they later on find the area of the game it's intended to kind of teach them the meaning of that symbol, that whole sequence falls apart completely. And you may have wanted to do something very interesting with that sequence rather than doing a straightforward communication of the idea. You might have wanted to like play with the space of what kind of things might it possibly mean. And now that's just kind of a boring section that the player has to do because they learned it elsewhere. Anyway, so the solution here was just to not allow this error flashing on these knowledge gate puzzles. Okay, so another very, very important thing in witness-like puzzle games is that the puzzles actually affect the environment. And it's that's because it's important that when you have this game with a large world and there's these abstract puzzles that are kind of dumped in it, you don't want the game to just be like doing Sudoku puzzles on an island. So one way to kind of deal with that is you can have puzzles that affect certain things in the environment. So here's an example from the witness where this is a puzzle that the shape that you draw on the panel affects the shape of the bridge that you're standing on. However, the connection there is not entirely obvious due to the first person perspective. And here's a bird's eye view of that puzzle that makes it a little more apparent that the shape of that bridge is corresponding to the shape on the panel, right? So you see these yellow blocks here. There's kind of these triominoes. That's a Tetris block that has 3 squares. And so you see there's one here and one here and one here, right? And so the shape that you're drawing kind of corresponds that. And you can draw it the other way and the bridge will move to the other side. In Taiji, because it's this top-down viewpoint, you have this kind of bird's eye view all the time. So it's much easier in that game to do these kind of puzzles because you can kind of just overlay the puzzle over the environment. And then you can see the one-to-one correspondence between that puzzle and the environment. Another maybe more basic example from the witness would be the various kind of machine control panels that you find throughout the game, which typically have multiple solutions, and depending on the exit chosen, the platform will move to a specific position. So you may be wondering, wait, what about the other way? We want environment and puzzle interaction, so what about when the environment affects the puzzle? And we will get to that in a second in talking about the environment. So there's some important aspects to witness-like games in terms of how they structure the environment, and I think the most important thing is that they should be open world games. And I'm not just saying this because the witness is open world. but rather because if you're making this kind of game, then typically you'll end up with very disparate subject matter across the puzzles in the game, and the most kind of natural most natural order for non-linear subject matter is a non-linear game. Um, an additional benefit of going open world is that the player is less likely to become roadblocked on a single puzzle. We mentioned that earlier. So both of these things kind of are important and get kind of solved by going open world. Another kind of not so obvious thing if you have an open world game is that if you do become roadblocked, you could go somewhere else and do something else. And if the game is very thematically consistent, all the puzzles kind of have a certain underlying design ethos or whatever. As the player solves more puzzles in the game, they get more aligned with the design of the game. And so even if they're solving puzzles somewhere else in the game that don't really have anything to do with the area that they were stuck on, because they've sort of experienced more of the game, they start to kind of develop a idea in their head about what are the kinds of things that might make sense to be a solution in this game. And that will often help them when they come back to that puzzle that they're stuck on. And the final thing, although it's a bit of a shallow thing, is that exploration is just fun and adds a lot of enjoyment to the game on its own. And I think that like there is something more satisfying about The Witness and Sensorium than like similar Witness-like games that are just puzzles without the exploration element. Okay, so another aspect of the environment or the structure of the game, right, that's really important in Witness-like games is that you have sub-areas that group together subject matter. So what I mean by that is that there's just going to be these different twists that are on the core mechanic, and you should group all puzzles of a specific twist into one physical area in the world. Oftentimes, these areas will feature more linear puzzle sequences, so you can kind of think of the overall structure of the game as like a very non-linear world that has smaller, more linear sections in it. Each of these areas is often defined by like a distinct visual theme. And ideally, this visual theming should be reflective somehow of the subject matter of the puzzles. At a minimum, that can just be like a justification for the puzzles to even occur. So if you have this series of puzzles that are about trees, then you like turn the area into an apple orchard. And at best, you can kind of use the theming to provide layers of metaphor and context. And we'll return to that a bit in the story section. Okay, so coming back to that point about connection between the environment and the puzzles, now we're going to look at it from the other way. So it's important in a Witness-like game that the environment affects the puzzles. So here's an example from Taiji where the shape of some nearby trees is really important to the puzzle solving. You kind of pay attention to those trees and you notice different things about them. Here's an example from Sensorium where there's shadows that are being cast from some rocks nearby this open window, and that informs the puzzle solution. The point is that you just want as much interaction as you can have between the environment and the actual puzzle solving. Otherwise, you might as well just be making an iOS game that's just a book of puzzles. Because if you're going to be making this big, large open world environment, that's like very expensive, and you should justify all of that additional effort that you have to put into building that environment by integrating it into the gameplay. So, this is maybe a little bit of an extension of the previous point, but I also think that it's very important in a Witness-like game to kind of have these hidden in plain sight secrets. It's sort of something that the Witness sets up, and I think you kind of have to capitalize on that expectation to some extent. Now, it's hard to kind of talk about this without spoiling things, but I'm going to kind of just try to attempt to discuss it as an extension of what I just discussed about justifying the extension of the environment. But I will, as a preamble, say The Witness is a game that is in large part about epiphany and experiencing a moment of revelation as you discover the truth and you see the world around you from an entirely new perspective. And to that end, the environments are carefully constructed so that perceptive players might start to notice echoes of the puzzles in the environment around them. At a very basic and obvious level, the player might notice that there's some oddly shaped things in the environment that resemble the various elements of the puzzles. And on a somewhat less obvious level, the player might notice these statues or some environmental details which are suggestive of some kind of narrative. This will get covered a bit more in the story section. And on an even more subtle level, the environments themselves are often reflective of the puzzle themes in some kind of very, very subtle way. But all of these details are things that the player might look at and just see nothing special, or they might discover an unlikely connection. I attempted to do some of these things in Taiji as well, though there's a lot fewer there since I was naturally more budget constrained. You know, something that's important to understand about these kind of secrets is that the best secrets take a lot of work, and the Witness and Taiji's secrets both took inadvisable amounts of development time to create. By which I mean, like, if any sane person had been in charge of the development process of Taiji, then they would not have recommended that I spend almost a year on a part of the game that maybe 3% of players would even engage with. I think the final numbers ended up higher than that, just because puzzle game players tend to be pretty dedicated. But in any case, you'd still probably use that time to polish up the parts of the game that the majority of players would see. But I do think, again, it's important to satisfy those expectations that the Witness has set. And that expectation for this genre is that the game have substantial and high quality secrets. And players can really tell if a secret is high quality or if you're just sort of phoning it in. You know, it's not really enough for the player to just find something that's hidden. The thing that they find has to have actual value, and high value secrets are just more worth the player's time to dig for them. So, like, why should they put in the effort if you didn't? Okay, so final section, story. Story, I think, is an extremely important element of the Witness. However, it's an element that I think that no other Witness like, including my own, truly nails. So you can kind of think of this next section as being a bit more speculative than the sections that we've had before. In any case, the purpose of the story in the Witness is to kind of connect things in the game to things in the real world, and to encourage the player to think about those things in ways that are more subtle and non-obvious. You know, so there's like some things in the game that are very obvious how you might think about them in the real world, like there's the area where you look at things under colored light, and it's like, well, if you're looking at things under colored light in the real world, then you're going to see things that remind you of what you saw in the game. But the purpose of the story elements in the Witness, I think, is to kind of point at things that are less obvious connections than that. Now, some people might suggest that the Witness barely even has a story to begin with. And if we were to just consider story to be like a series of events that happen with characters, then yeah, the Witness basically doesn't have a story. So I'm choosing to expand the definition of what I put into the story category to include more of the thematic elements in the game. So, of course, in terms of verbal communication, you have the audio logs and the video clips, and those are kind of what people would typically consider the story, and they do have some small character elements there. But additionally, the game does layer on quite a few thematic elements in the form of its environments. So there's the area theming and statues, and of course there's like hidden objects to find. So some people would call this theming instead of story, but I'm just kind of lumping it all together into the category of story. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, it's sort of impossible to tease out subcategories of the Witness's game design completely and analyze them in isolation. And we had to kind of pick some categories, and so whatever, it's story. So discussion of stories in games in general is very fraught with peril, since there's many approaches that you can take and be successful with. But I do think that the most natural approach is to treat the story as though it's like an extension or illustration of the gameplay mechanics. So this way to approach story, which the Witness chooses, is kind of thinking about how the gameplay could be interpreted metaphorically and how that relates to everyday life. So in the Witness, the primary thematic metaphors that the game uses are truth and perspective. So in the gameplay, you have to draw these lines through puzzles to progress. And of course, some lines are more correct or true than others, and namely those that solve the puzzles. So therefore, you could kind of analogize the search for the correct line to the search for capital T truth in general. So what do I even mean by capital T truth? So what I mean is kind of like the deeper truth, the bigger truth that's hidden behind the numerous and relatively insignificant details of daily experience. So this is along the lines of Robert McKee's framing of in his book on screenwriting, story. So a story conveys the details of something that happens. So it's easy to think that like the more detail that you put into the story, the more you've conveyed the truth. You could, in an attempt to be very truthful, include the dialogue between the protagonist of the story and the Starbucks barista. He ordered an iced peppermint mocha, grande, half syrup. Oh, no, thank you. I'm not using the app. But this type of story detail is sort of boring, meandering, and pointless. The goal of a story is to convey something of use to the listener, and good storytelling like boils away all of the useless bits, and it leaves nothing but the capital T truth. So if you include irrelevant details in an attempt to seek truth, you've instead created verisimilitude, and the listener has, in some sense, experienced it as you experienced it, but you haven't saved them any time. And instead, you've abdicated your perspective in storytelling, and you've kind of left the interpretation of life's events entirely up to the listener. And you've missed the forest for the trees. In any case, the search for truth in arts, science, philosophy, and religion is the search for deeper meaning beneath the surface of things. And the witness takes this process itself as its primary metaphor and subject matter. The theme of perspective, of course, comes from the game being a first-person perspective game, and many puzzles requiring the player to find the right point of view in order to divine the solution to a puzzle. In the audio logs part of the story, this perspective theme is primarily manifest as the different historical perspectives on what the truth might even be, primarily whether it's discovered in science or spirituality, whether one looks within themselves or out towards the world for truth. And sometimes multiple truths can be in conflict with one another. So again, in The Witness, the story metaphor can roughly be boiled down to perspective and the search for truth. To give another example, in Taiji, although the story I think is expressed much less fully, the metaphor is something like the search for balance in opposites. So both of these are kind of vast simplifications of like the meaning of the game, but they at least give you some kind of ballpark about where you might look for good story ideas. Opposingly, how could one recognize bad story ideas? The most obvious thing is if they have nothing to do with the subject matter of the game whatsoever. So the story should have something to do with the gameplay, but it's important to understand that the story should not be directly about the puzzles. A story about somebody who's solving puzzles is not likely to be interesting, and even if it is interesting, then it's not likely to be good, at least the way that I'm talking about it here. And I'll give the obvious counterexample of Portal in a bit.
Yeah, it's called Ascend.
What? That's sick.
Just imagine if Link was saying, yo, what, that's sick, every time he did a rewind. How cool would that be?
Hang on, did you just shift reality?
Okay, so the wow, I just moved that with my freaking mind school of writing is not going to produce good results. And instead, the story should be more metaphorical and should attempt to move in parallel with the subject matter of the puzzles. It's perhaps simple enough to kind of think of that as like something that the puzzles made me think about. Though the further and the deeper one goes with this kind of layering of meaning, the more resonant the story will be. However, it's important to not just do some kind of lazy layering of deep meaning that has really nothing to do with the actual gameplay. Just because you made the Tetris blocks into slaves and you're piling them into a colonial era slave ship doesn't mean that Tetris is now somehow art. Ironically, I think that the Witness parody, The Looker, does a quite excellent job of pairing an appropriate story with its core mechanics. The core mechanic of the game is a quite messy and freeform version of the Witness's draw a line concept. So the lines that the player draws tend to come out comically amateurish because they have to be drawn freehand with the mouse. And this comedic aspect of the core mechanic then dovetails really nicely with the overall comedic approach of the game. However, comedy is often a cheap way to get an audience to like the story in a game, and this is somewhat of a tangential aspect from whether the story is good or not. For example, the story in Portal 2 is mostly about evil AIs that are competing for world domination. Uh, and the story part that has anything to do with the puzzles is actually more like just an excuse for there to be puzzles at all. You're solving puzzles because there's an evil computer that's making you solve puzzles. My overall advice, though, on story for Witness-like games is the same as kind of my advice on story for any game, which is that if it's not really part of the initial idea for the game, then it can be very hard to bolt on a story and have good results. And ultimately, if it's too much effort to integrate a story into the game, then it may be the best decision to just not have a story at all. So a good story is better than no story, but no story is better than a bad story. This is partly the approach that I took with Taiji. There were several story elements with the game that were very clear to me from the beginning. For example, the black ending of Taiji was like basically in my mind before I even designed the first puzzle. But there were other elements that never really came together. For example, I found that it was very hard to think of ways to integrate dialogue into the game without kind of watering down the inherent meaning of the game. And a big part of this is because when there's words in a game, players tend to think the game is about the words. There's an old Zen parable in which the Buddha points at the moon and the unenlightened acolyte protests, "What's so important about your finger?" So my point here is that it's perhaps inevitable in the attempt to point towards the depth of subject matter that you will lose some players. This type of thing happened in particular with Braid, where the shocking nature of the ending of the game often derailed players' understanding of the overall themes of the game, which are much more non-linear than most other game stories. So another factor in my overall very minimal story in Taiji was sort of my fear of seeming pretentious. And I think that's kind of like my biggest regret overall in the development of Taiji is that like fear of failure kind of prevented me from really trying very hard to get the story to work.
Nothing is so terrible as a pretentious movie. I mean, a movie that aspires for something really terrific and doesn't pull it off is shit, it's scum. And everyone will walk on it as such. And that's why poor filmmakers, in a way, that's their greatest horror, is to be pretentious. So here you are, on one hand, is trying to aspire to really do something. On the other hand, you're not allowed to be pretentious. And finally you say, fuck it. I don't care if I'm pretentious or not pretentious, or if I've done it or I haven't done it. All I know is that I am going to see this movie. And that for me, it has to have some answers. And by answers, I don't mean just a punchline. Answers on about 47 different levels. And it's very hard to talk about these things without being very corny. You use a word like self-purgation or epiphany, they think you're either a religious weirdo or an asshole college professor. But those are the words for the process, this transmutation, this renaissance, this rebirth, which is the basis of all life.
I don't know why that didn't full screen, but technology. Yeah, so I was a little bit afraid of seeming pretentious, and I think maybe I could have channeled Coppola here and just said, F it. But to be a little more forgiving to myself, it's not as though story is something that can just be slathered on your game like barbecue sauce. A more detailed story begets more questions about why exactly things in the game are the way they are. And because I'm a big believer in holistic game design, there has to come some kind of dialogue between the written story and the other elements of the game. So if the characters in the game start talking about some area in the game, then that means there's questions about the internal logic of the world, and now that area has to have some kind of in-universe justification, and it can't just be seen as an aesthetic environment in which to experience the puzzles. Of course, doing better on story front and all these fronts makes your game richer and deeper, but for 90% of development, Taiji was just being created by myself alone, and adding story to the game would have taken some of my energies away from other elements of the game, possibly making those elements worse or delaying the game further, and the game already took 8 years. So, in summary, a good story is hard to build. And as a final note on this topic, words are fundamentally outsized in the amount of focus they draw in a game, especially a game that has very few words in it. The few words that you use will have a very significant impact. And so that impact has to be chosen very carefully and directed appropriately, inwardly towards the subject matter in particular. All right, so it's a very philosophical discussion about how I think The Witness approaches story. And maybe it's a bit too philosophical. Maybe I've like lost you. So let's kind of circle back a bit and let's do a bit more of a practical or analytical approach to this first point. So like, what do I even mean by illustration of gameplay? So functionally, what I mean is that the story in the game serves the same purpose that an illustration does in a novel. So the text is, of course, the core of the novel, but the illustrations in an illustrated novel are sort of an enhancement that help you understand that text or visualize it in a new way. So for my conception here of story in games as an illustration, the core of the game is still the gameplay, and the story is just something that helps you understand that gameplay more deeply. So obviously you can have a novel without illustrations, and you can have a game without story as well. Here's a quote from a chat member when we were working on this working on this lecture. So the great philosopher Zhao Zen says, "The simulation is at the core of any game, and it is what any game is about. However, you can shed light on different aspects of that and zoom in on certain bits by coding the simulation with metaphors." So essentially that's kind of another way of saying this story as illustration. Like what does it do, right? It sheds lights on different aspects and it zooms in on certain bits by using metaphor. So an interesting thing that you can do with this kind of illustration thing is that if you provide the illustrations in absence of the context, then that actually generates mystery for the player. So in this particular example from Game of Thrones, there's this illustration here that when a reader would reach this drawing, they're not quite sure what they're looking at until they read the chapter that comes after it, unless they've been spoiled by the TV show. So it's, a bit of a mystery and maybe a little bit of a surprise when they come back after they finish the chapter and look at the drawing again and go, oh, now I see what that is. And the story in games can be used in a similar way. So in each world in Braid, the player first, on their way into the world, has to go through these screens that are in the clouds, and they're presented with these paragraphs of story. And importantly, this always happens before the player even encounters the first puzzle of that world. And since the story is meant to be reflective of the themes of the puzzles, they lack the context to actually fully understand the story when they run into it. And The Witness is similar, both with its audio logs and just the environmental theming of the areas and the statues, which are all kind of story elements, I would argue, in that you encounter these things typically without having sufficient context to totally understand the metaphor and how it relates to the puzzles. Okay, so let's look at how The Witness uses the environment as kind of like an extension of this story concept. So as we said before, the story itself should be informed and inspired by the gameplay and kind of be an illustration of that gameplay. And this does extend to the environments, which I consider part of the story, at least in this context. So sometimes the connection between the puzzles and the environment sort of starts out very simply. It's just kind of an excuse for the puzzles to even exist. Like this is an area where you do puzzles and you're like walking through mazes. So what would make sense for that? Well, I guess like hedge mazes, right? Hedge mazes are mazes that you walk through that are like human sized, right? And hedge mazes are pretty old. Like, didn't medieval castles sometimes have hedge mazes in them? And you know, we want to have this moment where the player like climbs up to somewhere really high and they like look back down on those hedge mazes from earlier and they have like a new perspective on them. And from this perspective, they sort of like resemble the normal puzzle panels that they've been doing. So they were before they were like down in the weeds doing the puzzles, but now they can like look down and admire their handiwork. You know, and castles often had these kinds of towers, so I guess it's a medieval castle, and that seems like those are enough good reasons for the theming. And then you might look kind of at what you've created and see like, well, you know, now it's this medieval castle, but it also has this high technology in here of these puzzle panels, and there's wires all over the place. So it's sort of got this kind of oxymoronic contradiction between like an ancient castle and like modern technology. And so then you might decide, well, actually, we're going to lean into that and we're going to enhance that theme. And so now we're going to have like these statues in here that represent that contradiction. So, like, there's these guards here and they have swords. So they're sort of medieval, but they're also like kind of modern day, maybe club bouncers or like government agents. You can see he has like a little wire into his ear here. You know, additionally, you know, might represent that some other ways. So there's sort of this bard who's serenading the king's court, but you know, he's kind of like a modern day version of a bard because he's playing an electric guitar and there's an amplifier there. So although many players would kind of just think of these as like the environment, I think you could think of this as like a very different form of environmental storytelling. Where the point is not to like tell you that somebody died here and their skull was placed in a toilet, but it perhaps acts as like a bit of a visual pun. And by this, I don't necessarily mean that the connection is intended to generate humor, although it could, but just that the two things are connected in sort of this indirect way, where the primary function of the environment is like not to express that connection, but instead just to be a normal environment. But there's sort of like a hidden environmental riffing on the puzzles there that's very subtle, and many people could play the game and they wouldn't even notice these connections. But this is an extension of that like gameplay illustration part of the story, right? So for another example, in Taiji, I can actually tell you, you know, why did I choose a specific theming. So there's an area where you do these diamond puzzles, and I themed it as a mine, and that was simply just a pun because you mine for diamonds. You know, and what's really the difference between like this dumb of a thematic decision and something with more depth, like areas in the Witness? Mostly it's about layering and sophistication again, right? So to come back to that earlier point, it's like as it becomes more sophisticated, it actually kind of becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Even if it starts kind of silly, like there's a richness that gets built up there. This kind of thematic connection can go sort of the other way, and you can have puzzles that back reference the environment. So a good example of this from The Witness is the windmill in the town area, whose entrance door is a puzzle that sort of resembles the blades of the windmill when you solve it, right? Sort of drawing this like cross shape that matches the blades of the windmill. Okay, so the final point about story in Witness-like games is that it needs to be optional. The story can't be too overbearing, and players should just be able to enjoy the game on a surface level if they're not interested in the story. The Witness expresses this most obviously with the audio logs in the game because they're often hidden in out of the way places, and the player could play a large portion of the game and not even know that they're there. But generally, the approach of story in The Witness is as something that you can ignore if you wanted to, and it's there for players that want that, and they can dig deeper. You know, another reason for this, making the story kind of out of the way and more optional, is because you kind of want to imply something about the importance of the story, right? So words are very, very heavy tools, and you don't want players to think that the game is about the words. And if you put the story out of the way, then that ensures that. Now, you also have to be careful with the details of the story as well, because if you're not careful, then you can diminish the game. You know, an example would be like if you add in a bunch of interpersonal drama between characters into your puzzle game, it's like, is the game really about interpersonal drama? And if like it's not, then why is it in your game? Okay, so to sum up this section about story, I spent a lot of time discussing story. But I want to ask, like, is story an essential element of a witness-like? I said that no other witness-like game even really nails it. So I'm going to leave that a little bit as an open question because I don't really know. But I do think that it's at least an essential element of the witness. And so I wanted to cover it in this talk that's like a bit of an analysis of the witness and a bit of an analysis of like what is the genre that the witness is in. And that brings us to the end of the talk. So, in summary, here's like a summary slide of all the important elements of witness-like games that we've covered. And I'm hoping that covering this will like help you at least in analyzing the witness, but additionally, I hope that when people talk about other games as being witness-likes, that you now can kind of tease apart the ways in which the games are similar. And I'm not going to do like this is a witness like and this isn't a witness like. That's kind of for you to draw the line of like how many of these elements a game has to have for you to call it a witness like. But at least I've kind of covered the the ground floor here because I feel like there's a lot of confusion about like what does it even mean to say a game is a witness like game, and to me it's pretty clear. It's a game that has these elements or has a majority of these elements. So that's the end of the talk. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'll mention that if this talk was interesting to you, then you might be interested in my own take on a witness-like game, which is Taiji. It's available on Steam and very recently released on the Nintendo Switch. Some people seem to really like it, so you might like it too, especially if you liked The Witness. And I'll kind of leave you with a little bit of additional reading here or homework, right? Obviously, more time spent playing The Witness will help you to understand it better, but I think another thing that kind of gives you some insight into the context is John Blow gave a talk in 2011 with Mark Ten Bosch called Designing to Reveal the Nature of the Universe. And that talk sort of outlines the kind of aesthetic sensibilities by which The Witness was created. Anyway, so that's the end of the talk, and I will take some questions, and that's going to be a separate thing. This part was recorded separately, and the questions will be kind of stitched in here at the end. All right, so on to me from the future.